Hey everybody, it's Joe from Gadgetry Tech, and in today's video we're going to talk about the Vincent Audio 237 MKII. This is a hybrid amp. It's a tube and solid state amplifier that sells for $2,500 US. Now I know that price isn't cheap. There are amplifiers that are significantly more expensive and of course significantly less. So I'm going to maintain that perspective when I talk about this and compare it to other amplifiers both above and below this price range. Now this was sent to me for review by Vincent Audio, so huge thanks to them. It won't affect what I say about it. No monetary kickbacks on the back end. I'm not getting this for free. This gets sent back, so I don't have any incentive to sell it. I also have no special affiliate links if you decide to purchase it. But I will have generic links in the description below. If it's on Amazon, it'll support the channel to an extent. Otherwise, I'll also have links for some other amps I talk about. And of course, feel free to purchase it wherever you like, because there's a lot of dealers that carry this as well, which I always recommend considering if you want the support. Now, starting with the basic specs, let's get into power first. Now, this is rated at 150 watts times 2 continuous at 8 ohms and 250 watts times 2 continuous at 4 ohms. This is a hybrid, but it also has pure Class A for the first 10 watts of power, which is quite a bit of Class A power, and you'd be surprised how much volume you get from that. Class A has pros and cons. A lot of people on the audiophile side like Class A because of its transient performance and typically sounds more musical. There have been immense improvements on other technologies, especially when you get into Class D and above that are more digital. But the biggest thing is power gating. And when you have Class A, it's running at full tilt, whether you need that power or not, which is why you see these huge heat sinks on the side. Now, this uses Toshiba transistors on the output stage for solid state, and that's mounted to that metal plate. It's a very symmetric design, and this is designed to pull a lot of that heat out. So the amplifier does need some breathing room. Don't put this in a very compact cabinet and expect it to maintain cold temps. It will build up some heat in there. I ended up keeping this on a Pangea Vulcan audio rack. Pangea Audio is another company that's under the same umbrella as Vincent Audio. They make a huge array of configuration options, both in finishes, overall height, spec, etc. for different weight classes. And that gave me enough room. It had the depth and height that I needed to fit an amplifier like this because it is a little bit on the larger side. And because it's so deep, don't expect this to fit in a more shallow, TV stand type thing. Removing the lid on the top of this exposes a massive power supply. Power supplies are such a critical component for amplifiers, just as much as the other stuff, if not more, because that's literally the engine that's driving the amp. And if you don't have a good power supply and you don't have good capacitance, when you turn it up and that really strong bass note hits, you're basically starving the output stage, or in this case, the transistors, of the power they need to give you the transients that you're looking for, or the bass extension you're looking for without distortion. So this is a massive power supply. The design is absolutely gorgeous. Everything is very symmetric inside. So it's laid out well from the get-go. They didn't just put a bunch of good components inside a chassis and call it a day. This also uses WEMA caps, and it has a high amount of output capacitance on both channels as well, again, to augment the power delivery of the power supply, because that can't kick out all the power at once if there's an immediate need for it. So that's where the capacitors come in. You'll also notice that the front of the chassis is isolated from the back as well. They have a nice big metal wall there, and even the logic boards are separated. And a lot of this is designed to reduce channel crosstalk, buzzing, humming issues, everything isolated with a purpose, not so much just from a physical design requirement, but they do that to reduce audible artifacts when you're listening to it at larger or higher volumes, I should say. Even the tone defeat board, if you press the button on the front to bypass bass and treble adjustments, it's not that you're just turning off the knob or setting it to 0. It actually bypasses that segment entirely inside through a physical switch, because again, if you're chasing the purest, most direct audio performance, those are the little things that start to add up. Now, I mentioned this being a hybrid, and on the tube stage, which is your preamp stage, it's using 2 different tubes. You have the 12AX7, which is what actually is going to affect the sound quality to an extent. Then you have the 6N1P output tubes, and those are designed to do your output gain to feed the Toshiba solid state transistors I was talking about earlier. So you don't have to change the 6N1Ps at all to affect sound quality. You would only change them if they fail over time, because they're running on the output side. When you have higher voltage, the tubes eventually have a shelf life. So if you notice something starts to sound off, maybe look at that. The 12AX7 though is really where all of your tonality would come from. You will get a mild change in performance. This isn't like a full tube amp, but you can alter it a little bit. I did not roll the tube on my model, so everything I talk about is going to be based off the included tube, which is a Russian tube. It's a really nice quality tube. So in the past, when I reviewed the SV-500, I didn't modify that one either. I've been pretty happy with what they pair with the amp. As far as controls go, I'm going to start with the remote and then get into the layout and buttons on the amp, because there's not a lot to adjust here, but the stuff you do adjust can make a big difference on sound. So the remote's pretty straightforward. You have a mute button, you have a dimmer for that front illuminated window, which showcases that wonderful tube I was talking about. And then you'd basically just have source selection and volume. S1 is coaxial, S2 is optical, and then you have S3 for your Bluetooth connection, and then S4, S5, and S6 for analog. So you have several ways you can connect devices to this. Now it uses a Burr Brown DAC. There's no USB input, which is a bummer for me because I'd love the ability to connect a USB connection from, let's say, my MacBook directly to the amp to get immediate change for digital signals or digital sources. I ended up using Cambridge Audio on the source side. Now I use the MXN 10 on the streamer and the Cambridge DAC Magic 200M for my USB DAC. Both of those are wonderful components. They're very affordable, and I love the sound quality they have for the price. They run nice and cool, and the aesthetic works with most devices. So I connected them with analog directly to this and bypassed the Burr Brown DAC entirely, not because I don't like it, but if I'm paying for a more expensive DAC setup on the source side, I would rather just run analog to it. Now I mentioned S3 being Bluetooth, and it works. I'm not going to spend $2,500 on an amp though, just to use a Bluetooth connection for music. I think it's there more for convenience personally, but even just buying a network streamer I think would go a long way for getting the most out of what you're paying for. I did test it though. It comes with a little mini antenna to screw onto the back, but I removed it because I don't even want to see it there. I really only used it for testing, and it worked fine. The range was okay. You can go 30 to 40 feet, no problem. But again, I would just prefer to stick with the more traditional connections. As far as speaker connections go, you have 2 pairs of binding posts per channel. So you traditionally think of that as like a left and right A or B speaker selection, but there's no A/B speaker selector on this. Both outputs per side, left and right, are live at the same time. So you wouldn't want to use this amplifier with 2 different pairs of speakers because frankly, you're dealing with other issues with impedance and stuff. This is more designed for speakers with 2 sets of inputs, like, one for your highs and mids and one for your low frequencies. If you're doing like a bridge speaker or a bi-amp type setup, you could use this amplifier for that. It's more common on higher output, higher end amplifiers to do something like that. So just make sure you know what you're getting in case that was a requirement. Now you also get 2 12-volt triggers if you want to use this to turn on other components once it's toggled on and off, because again, this does work as a preamp. Now this has 2 sets of outputs. It has the record out or REC out, which is a live full volume output that bypasses all of the preamp section. It's designed to basically whatever analog connection you've selected, it just sends it right back out untouched. Now you have a preamp output stage as well, which is affected by the tonality of the tube amp. So if you want to use this as only a preamp, which I don't think you would buy this for that, but if you're connecting this to other power amplifiers, that is a variable output, again with the tonality benefits of this particular tube pairing. The other reason why you would want that pre-out, it doesn't specifically say subwoofer, but you could use this as a subwoofer output as well. Now this is a full range output and it's in stereo. So if you have a subwoofer, make sure you get one that has a low pass filter, something that's designed to only allow low frequencies to be sent to the sub itself, so you get control over that. You also want to make sure that if you only have one sub, get the little RCA adapter, for example, something on Amazon that will combine both left and right outputs of this amp into a single output. That way your sub is getting the sub-based frequencies for both the left and right. I'll have a link in the description as something basic that will work, but just again, keep that in mind. Now let's take a look at the front of the unit. And I like the design because it's very symmetric. You have 4 knobs on it that are basically the same size, even though they of course serve different functions. So you have a big old power button up front, traditional push button switch, and that will turn the unit on. The glow will immediately happen on the front tube and the amplifier will go into its warm-up stage, which takes a little bit of time before you actually get output because you don't want to immediately send sound out while the tubes are coming to temp. The rightmost knob is your volume adjustment, which has a hard stop for the minimum and maximum volume. And when you adjust the volume on the remote, there's a little stepping motor inside, which will light up a red LED when it's on, and you'll see the knob kind of move up and down on its own. This one doesn't hum like the SV-500 did. There's better isolation with this model. Usually when you get a stepping motor or a motor of any kind on the volume adjustment, you can typically hear a little bit of a hum just while it's adjusting, but it wasn't really audible with this one. As you change inputs, you'll have the LED light along the bottom of the amp change as well to show you which one you're on. As you move to the left, you have a bass adjustment and treble adjustment. Now, you don't have to use these, of course, and even if they are adjusted, if you maxed out bass and treble, if the tone defeat button is on the bottom, those knobs don't do anything. That is like a quick switch to enable or disable that panel I was talking about earlier. So if you are making changes to bass and treble and you're not hearing anything, check that tone defeat button, make sure it's set to the correct setting. You also have a little button on the front called loud. Now, it doesn't make the amplifier significantly louder or anything, but it does adjust the frequency sound signature, you know, like your bass mid treble curve, if you will. It makes it less flat to make the music sound more exciting. There is a bass lift and a treble lift. Now, I've talked about this on several videos in the past, but if you're new to the channel, there's this curve called the Fletcher-Munson curve, which basically suggests that we prefer a different sound signature at low volumes compared to high volumes because our ears are sensitive to different frequencies depending on amplitude. So the idea of this is if you have the receiver or amplifier in this case set to a lower volume, if you press loud, it's going to boost the bass and boost the treble a little bit to, again, make it sound more exciting, less flat, less dull. None of this is like a guarantee you will like one over the other, but is a very dramatic sound impact on it. So play with that. As you turn it up, you may still like it on. Maybe you have an older recording that's really dull, but you want to bring some energy to it. You can hit that button. It's kind of like a wake-up call for whatever you're listening to. Now, this does have a headphone jack on the front, and it's better suited towards higher impedance headphones. I didn't like the performance on lower impedance, especially on planar magnetics and IEMs. It doesn't like to be pushed at higher volumes. There's a little bit of output distortion. So if you have like a 120 to 300 ohm Sennheiser Beyerdynamic type headphone, then this output will be fine. Otherwise, I strongly recommend having a dedicated headphone amp for that. It's there, it works, I just wanted to mention it. So let's finally talk about sound quality because there's a lot to discuss here, and depending on your speakers, your room, your hearing, what you listen to, a lot of these differences aren't like one for one going to apply to you. So I want to keep it straight because I don't believe in snake oil. I don't believe in saying that $1,000 cable is going to magically transform the soundstage of even a $50,000 speaker. It's very hard, if not impossible, to hear a difference. That's just not how cables typically work. I'm going on a tangent, but I want to apply that to amplifiers because just because this has a tube, just because this has a giant power supply, it doesn't guarantee it's going to have some level of sonic performance. And some people will not hear a difference to a $300-400 amplifier. That's okay because that means you can save your money and enjoy something that still makes you happy, right? So when I've done a lot of critical listening with this, I was fortunate enough to get an A/B selector for both speakers and amps. It's from Neo Hippo. I reviewed it in the past, but that let me very quickly toggle between amps and speakers in my main listening position to hear any difference, whether it's very drastic or how subtle. That's really the only way to hear a drastic difference. Now, had I not had that, this in pure direct mode, you know, tone defeat off, loudness off, versus my $1,200 Yamaha amplifier that I reviewed in the past, it's a very subtle difference on certain tracks. So, you know, I don't, again, want to say this was such a massive improvement over that amp. Had I not been able to A/B it, the differences would become less apparent. Now, it can get even more confusing when you have, like, you know, Yamaha is embracing digital signal processing with sound correction. You know, it has the YPAO for room correction to adjust frequencies. And I'm not using this video to sell you on the Yamaha because if in that review, I actually didn't like what some of that room correction did. It sucked out some of the mids. It changed the treble to an area that I wasn't as much of a fan of. So in a lot of cases, I left YPAO off. I didn't like the output of that, and that put me back in pure direct mode. This is a much more traditional amp. It's not using digital signal processing to change the sound. This is done purely on an analog level to get the sonic performance it wants. Now you have very big differences when you boost treble and bass just by turning the knobs. You have a huge difference when you press the loudness button. So again, it's not always going to be apples to apples. In my binaural recording, I'm going to leave them both in pure direct mode, and then later I'll show you what the loud button does and also the tone buttons. Having said all that, as I listen to this, and I've had this for a couple months now, so huge thanks to Vincent Audio for being patient. I'm really particular about amps and speakers, and I like to get as much time as I can. This adds the subtlest touch of warmth over the Yamaha amp in pure direct mode. It just has just a little bit, just slightly emphasized mid bass, and it's slight. It's not like when you plot it out in a frequency response that it's going to have a big boost, but when you listen to a lot of music on it, particularly like bass guitars, it just has a touch more presence and body to it. If you have higher bass performing speakers, something that has a good, sub 100 hertz performance, you will notice it just a little bit more on something like this. It's really, really subtle. To kind of quickly summarize how this stacks up with the other two amps, the Yamaha is incredibly neutral. It's clean, it's dark, there's no noise issues. The bass is great, but there's no, it doesn't have the same warmth as the Vincent amp has. The treble delivery on the Yamaha, not like as a fault, but it just becomes more noticeable on higher end amplifiers, is just a little bit smoother, slightly less grainy on the Vincent amp. The PS Audio Stellar Strata kind of skirts the line in between. It has a more refined upper frequency delivery. It's incredibly smooth while still being resolving, but it doesn't have the same tonal richness and warmth as the Vincent amp. So purely from trying to compare it as granularly as possible, the Vincent will have the edge, I think, for what a lot of people are looking for. Now, this does that by consuming an immense amount of power and generating more heat compared to the other two, which are much more efficient solid-state amplifications. So if you're willing to sacrifice some of the heat and maintenance issues of tubes, I think you'd be happier with the sound quality of this overall. And again, this is just comparing it to those two, but hopefully that kind of explains that. I don't think you're going to hear a massive difference in performance if you're listening to genres like EDM or hip hop, for example. Those aren't really going to do audiophile amps any justice because of the way they're mixed. And a sub $1,000 decent solid state amp will perform pretty much just as well. Obviously, you have the output wattage to consider. So if you're chasing really high SPL and your speakers can handle it, then yes, an amp like this with that much power is going to be beneficial. The difference that you get with a Vincent amp is more apparent on jazz music, classical, and acoustic rock or acoustic instruments. When you listen to what this can do as far as like refinement goes, that's where it becomes special. That slight tonal richness while also having a slightly smoother presentation is just incredible, honestly, and it's the best sounding amp I have when I listen to those genres. So now it's time to put on some headphones, IEMs, or earbuds for the binaural audio recording. So in this configuration, I had the speakers put in the exact same position. I had dual Audio-Technica AT897 shotgun microphones pointed at the same spot, and then I played some pink noise and used a calibrated SPL microphone to make sure that both amps in pink noise were generating 80 decibels of volume. That way, when I did A/B, a volume change wouldn't affect your perception of what amp sounds better or worse. And then the speakers I used was the Alta Audio Alyssa Bookshelf, $5,000 pair of bookshelf speakers. Incredible speakers, immense bass depth. I've talked about them in the past, and I'll probably bring them up again in the future. And then I had the Yamaha NS600A that comes later in the video. So for the amp switching, I did the Yamaha amp versus the Vincent, and that was the amp A/B switch. And then later I'll switch from the Alta Audio Alyssa to the Yamaha in the same exact position so you can hear how those sound when you switch amps. And then towards the end of this recording, the binaural section, I will be showcasing the loud button up front that I talked about to affect EQ, as well as the tonality adjustments for bass and treble.
my own world of make-believe. Kids screaming in their cradles, profanities. My world's so bright, it's hard to breathe, but that's alright. Hush.
So the outcome of that is going to be quite interesting for a lot of people, because keep in mind, this is a binaural audio recording in my room with my microphones. Then you're listening to it with your IEMs, headphones, whatever you're using. So you may not hear any difference at all between the amps. And that's not my goal, is to confuse you, but depending on your setup and what you can hear at home, you may hear a subtle difference. So I wanted to use this as a transparent of a demo as possible. I think the differences are more noticeable with classical music, something that's more subtle, that might have a more grainy or harsh at times upper treble performance. That's where the smoothness came in. But when the music was a little bit louder, more processed, more electronic, it's very difficult to hear the differences. What was noticeable, of course, was the loud button and the tonality adjustments, which is a nice, fun, very quick and easy way of adjusting your sound that, frankly, a lot of other amplifiers don't give you. The PS Audio Strata has no ability to change that, and the Yamaha amp, there's some basic adjustments you can do with YPAO, but it doesn't have the level of impact and excitement that this amp brings when you start enabling those. So that about wraps up the SV-237 Mark II video. Now, I want to be candid with you, because I don't believe in just spending a lot of money to always guarantee a certain level of performance. Purely on the sound quality side, for the amps that I have in my demo setup, I do like the 237 Mark II over the PS Audio Stellar Strata, which I purchased because I liked it so much. I like this sound a little bit more. I also like the sound of this more than the Yamaha amplifier, the network receiver I reviewed in the past, which is less money, of course, so that's to be considered. But it gets a little gray when you start considering the full feature set. If you just want a pure powerhouse in analog form that gives you really quick, simple adjustments, this is an incredible amplifier. It's one of the best sub $3,000 integrated amps you can get, period. Where it gets a little confusing is if you are not okay with servicing the tubes yourself, and it's very easy to do. Just undo all these screws here with the unit turned off and cool, and you can basically pull the tubes out and replace them. It's super easy to switch, but it does pull more electricity in because of that Class A power draw, along with the heat output that this amp does. So the other amps don't generate anywhere close to the amount of heat or power consumption that this does. So if that's an issue for you, then yes, that would be something to consider. But if you're like, I don't care about that, I'm buying this because I want pure sonic performance, then yeah, that's great. Now, this doesn't have any real digital features. It doesn't have a network streamer capability. So you do have to invest a little bit on the other stuff, whereas the Yamaha and PS Audio examples I mentioned both have network streaming functions. So had this had that, it would have been a knockout. But I would love to use this with my Cambridge setup that I was talking about, the DAC Magic and the MXN10. I think that's all you really need. and you'd be really happy with it. And it's very versatile from a power output because you can basically connect any size speaker you want and get the most of it. So with that being said, hopefully you found this video helpful and you learned something new about the SV-237 Mark II, or if you hadn't heard about it before, it should be on your radar because it's a stellar amp. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe so I can see you at the next video. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.